Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we've got a long video, as I think it's time to finally look back at this 2024 offseason for the Jacksonville Jaguars and give final grades to some of these moves. Now, of course, these are final grades going into the season before we've seen any of these players even take a snap during the regular season, or let alone preseason. Now, we'll know, obviously, years down the road a lot better. There will be misses in this video, I'm sure. But I just want to give my thoughts on, what I know about these moves and what I think about them and kind of my process in thinking those things. Because for me, it's a very mixed offseason. There were some moments of brilliance by the team, and we're going to highlight some of those at the end, but we're also going to highlight some of the whiffs. And there were some really bad ones by the Jaguars. They're just very frustrating problems that you could foresee, and it was almost not to try to just bear down on them at the start, but sometimes it's almost like watching a car crash, before it happens. You just know it's going to happen. You're just trying to warn them, like, stop, and you can't do anything about it. But that's what it's like being a football fan sometimes. And the good thing is that it was not just bad. It was not as bad as I think I had expected going into the offseason. I thought it would be pretty atrocious based off how they finished last year and some of the things said at early press conferences, but it was better than I expected, given those were very low expectations. But we're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to talk first about the front office moves, like GM, head coach, the coordinators. We'll talk a little bit about the staff, just the big firing on defense, and then we'll talk about the releases, the players that walked, even players that are just still sitting out there, guys that the Jaguars extended, guys they brought back, players that they brought in free agency. And then we'll talk about the draft, and we'll kind of just summarize most of this, talk about where they improved, where they got worse, and then maybe some of the things that don't get mentioned, like, maybe a contract not getting renegotiated, or the way they approach something. We'll talk about small things like that too, but we're going to try to hit everything we can in this video. So with that said, let's go ahead and start. So first things first, we're going to get into front office moves. And I actually had to restart this video, unfortunately, because I typed in Ryan Nielsen on this graphic, so I'm glad that's fixed now. But I wrote down 5 things here. And so we're really talking about 4 positions, and I noted the guys they kept because I want to at least have a conversation about it, even if some of them are just seem kind of stupid, right? Like Doug Pearson, he wasn't going anywhere, but I do want to talk about it for a moment because, keep in mind, this team finished year 1-5, and if a bunch of firings happened, there was justification for it. Whether or not we agreed with it, it's at least a conversation. So talking about the first thing, which was retaining Trent Baalke as the general manager. You guys know how I feel about him, and I'll be straight. Like, my opinion has not been just the same the whole way through Trent Baalke's tenure with the Jaguars. It has flipped a lot, and it's usually been based around how good the team has been doing. I started, disliking him because he was kind of a representation of doing things the old way, where Shad Khan would take half measures. He'd fire a head coach or a GM, but he'd keep the other. He'd never clean the house. And so that's where a lot of people just started with him, where they're like, this guy kind of sucks. Like, why are we keeping him? He was the assistant GM, and somehow we're just going to keep him. We're not going to interview anyone. Like, there's a bad start there, right? And then you had 2022, where things really flipped. And Trent Baalke went from being called a clown at the end of the previous season to now this team is a primed playoff contender, went into Arrowhead, had a good game against the Chiefs. They came close to taking him to the brink. They did not, but came very close. Very impressive season. And it looked like Trent Baalke was a genius, right? Because he had a ton of great moves in free agency, and his high moments have been very high. You can't take that away from him. Whether or not you like him, when he's on fire, he's on fire. And so I got really high on him again. You go into this year, they're performing really well. And then you get to the end of the season and things get exposed, and you start thinking back and looking at the decisions, and it's like, this was kind of stupid. Why did they not sign anyone last year? Why did they reach in the draft on almost every single pick in 2023, other than the first rounder, which was where he should have gone, and he's been better than pick number 27. I'm talking about Anton Harrison. So there's just things like that are very frustrating about Trent Baalke. And of course, there's a lot of people to blame for how 2023 ended. It's players, it's coaches, it's front office people. But Trent Baalke is a major part of that. And to me, like, having seen him here now for 3 seasons, I know what he is. And I also know, and this is really what solidifies my opinion and why it will probably not shift unless he just goes and wins a Super Bowl, which I don't think is going to happen, if I'm going to be honest. But it's the fact that when Trent Baalke had his press conference this offseason, he could not get himself to say that he had regrets. He's finding any way to get around it, saying, I don't live with regrets. I don't do that. And just essentially showing me that his ability to learn from his mistakes is very limited. And that's what's frustrating. And maybe he learns a little bit. I'm not saying he learns absolutely nothing from the things he does wrong, but it's very poor compared to what you would expect in the general manager. There's a lot of things about his thinking and his approach that are very frustrating. Like, this is a team that throughout his time, because I want to make this very clear, like, the way they build this team is poor right now. They spend a ton of money in free agency. Thankfully, although that's not a good thing, you don't want to be spending a ton in free agency, they do often hit on free agents. So that's solid. But you also get guys in that are just complete misses, guys who are a waste of money for the team. That's going to be a natural part of free agency. The frustrating part to me, and what kind of starts to do Trent Baalke in completely, is the draft process, where we hear things that kind of tell us, like, there are draft picks they predetermine before the pick's even up, and that kind of stuff limits you in your ability to get players who are falling past their consensus, players who are clearly better. You know, I understand if you're low on a player, right? And you don't have to take him right where someone has them on their consensus board, but when guys fall, you see the good teams swoop in and take those players. Look at the Baltimore Ravens this last year. You know, look at the players they picked in the 4th round. They got Devontae Walker, who was, I think, will be a very good pick. And I know he's got the bust potential, but I think that's a really good situation for him. And then TJ Tampa. Not that long after. Tampa, quite frankly, I'm kind of shocked the Jaguars didn't seem to like him. But, you know, he's a player that probably should have gone early second or mid second. That's about where I had him, and it was a very impressive pick by them. Teams like the Ravens, and you also throw out teams like the Chiefs, who, you know, throw out Kingsley Suamataia, their 2nd round pick. Like, they're stealing guys that should not be available at these selections, and that's helping them build a very good team. And unfortunately, the Jaguars with Trent Baalke have a process where a lot of the time they decide on who they're going to pick before the pick's up. They don't want to trade up. They don't send offers that are worth it. They lowball every single team they trade with, to the point where people don't, I doubt they'd want to answer the phone. I wouldn't. If they're calling me a trade up, I know it's going to be a crappy offer. And so you're just stuck in a position where even if those guys do fall into your lap, they're often skipping them. Like, you got to keep in mind with Antonio Johnson, well, that ended up being an incredible pick and one of the best picks of the last draft out of any team. They skipped him 5 times after he should have been a clear consensus top player. It was like 96. There was, 3 4th rounders they skipped him on. There was another 4th, one of those 4ths they traded out of, and then there was an early 5th that they skipped on him. And so it's just very frustrating to watch a draft process where a lot of the time, like, you're reaching, you're getting guys who their ceiling is either worth the pick or just slightly worth more. But simply put, not to spoil every single thing on it, because we will talk about Trent Baalke a little bit more in detail later this offseason, maybe not that far down the road. I just simply don't agree with this. I don't think Trent Baalke, the way he builds teams, is good enough to win a Super Bowl, and I don't think he's going to be able to learn and adapt to the point where he's learned enough to be able to win a Super Bowl. That's my issue with this decision. And now you kind of get in between a rock and a hard place, because if the team's good this year after spending a bunch of money and they make the playoffs, or they go 10-7 or whatever it is, and you don't get rid of him, you're kind of putting yourself in purgatory, unless, Trent Baalke proves us all wrong, which I don't think he's done that, and he'll have to do it first, right, before we accept that. But that's not just hatred. That's off his track record, because it's not like Jacksonville's the first place he's been a GM. So those are my thoughts on that. I gave it a D because I can understand why they didn't fire him. The team still had a winning record. You can blame things on injuries. Other people are involved in the collapse of the team last year. So to put 100% of it on Trent Baalke's shoulders is unfair. Now, talking about Doug Pearson, this is kind of a very simple one, right? But I want to note it at least because the team did have a collapse. And there was at least one point where, like, we were talking about maybe they'd like Bill Belichick. So the thought was at least there a little bit this offseason. At the end of the day, Doug Pearson was the catalyst in 2022 for this team to make the playoffs. There were a lot of other people you could try to throw in, right? You could throw in the free agents they signed and all that. But Doug Pearson brought this team together. He got Trevor Lawrence playing better that year, and he's the guy. Like, he's a Super Bowl winning head coach. I still think he's very good, and I really hope he takes over play calling this year. We'll see for sure, not too far down the road. But with Doug Pearson, it's a very good head coach that, yeah, he has some flaws. There's some issues with maybe a little too much loyalty to people, which doesn't seem like it should be an issue, but sometimes there's guys that, quite frankly, are not deserving of their roles, might be Press Taylor, and he will stick up for them every time. He will not consider moving on, even if it gets him fired. And I feel like we almost got close to that this offseason. I know in Philly, that was some of the reasoning for him getting fired, or it was at least talked about as an issue while he was there. And then the other thing, might get bad play calls once in a while. He's got a little bit of that Andy Reid in him where it's usually brilliant, but then you get like the stupid crap, and it's just part of it, right? But he's still a very good head coach, and, Doug Pearson should be the guy here. Yeah, I think the only way that you're ever considering moving on from him is if this team really collapses and there's some clear issues with his decision making. There would be a lot of things I think that still have to happen to get to the point where he's seriously considered to be a fireable person on this team. And so I like that move, if it's even a move. With OC Press Taylor, I gave it a C because I can see both sides of the argument. And I'd probably lean more towards, hey, this isn't really good enough. But at the same time, I understand that if they hired someone new, Doug Pearson has a huge influence on that person. I don't think it changes a ton about how the offense is ran. So I just don't think this was going to impact the team as much as we thought at first. And so that's why I ended up giving it a C. It just didn't really move the needle for me when I thought about it, giving it some time. Now, on the defense side of the football, a lot to talk about here, right, with front office moves. Mike Caldwell ended up being fired at the end of the season. He was the quote-unquote scapegoat. But when we learned about what was actually happening with that defense, whether or not Mike Caldwell approved of it or not, it made sense why he was fired, why tons of position coaches were fired, where a lot of people were out of the door. Because when you're leaving early during a game week, as if it isn't important to you, as if you're not in the freaking NFL, you don't deserve to be in the sport. You don't deserve to have a job. You don't deserve to be there. And so, I can't necessarily say I know exactly what Mike Caldwell was doing or what he thought of it. I honestly don't know. Maybe the actual truth is out there. I'm just not personally aware. But to let that happen with your staff is unacceptable. And it's not like Mike Caldwell is sharing power with someone else too, because this is very much a team where Doug Pearson is an offensive coach. He's going to work close with the OC. The DC is going to do his own thing. It's going to be very independent. And the DC is more so, if he's going to work with anyone, it's going to be the GM and determining maybe what players they bring in. And so Mike Caldwell had a lot of freedom and allowed for a lot of crappy things that I think directly played into the team missing the playoffs. Because even if you have the bad end of the season, you should have won at least one more game and beat Houston for the division. They did not, though. Mike Caldwell, I think at the end of the day, made sense to not keep his job here. And not that we're sitting here rooting for people to get fired, rooting for people to get released, all those things, right? But it is a sport, it's a business, and decisions have to be made. You can't be not everything can be an emotional decision. I think Mike Caldwell had some exciting moments in his time in Jacksonville. It just didn't make sense to keep him. And talking about what they did to pivot, and really the best move in the front office this offseason, and technically the only one other than firing Mike Caldwell, hiring DC Ryan Nielsen was a phenomenal move. If I was doing my S rankings or like the S grades, which is like elite, basically, it's above an A+, I would have given him an S. This was the perfect hiring. The only other guy I think I even considered over him was Ejiro Evero, who made a lot of sense, especially as like a scheme fit, and was a really good coach. Someone who was considered as a possible head coach down the road. But he also wasn't an option. Ryan Nielsen was, and I think what Nielsen brings in, for one, I think he's going to demand accountability out of this defense. I think his scheme is going to be phenomenal for what you're expecting out of a team that should be contending for a Super Bowl. You see a lot of these teams that succeed in the playoffs running man coverage. The Chiefs have done a lot of that recently. I think that's the best way you can run your defense, and I like that he's focused on that. I like that he runs press, and I like that he's a defensive line coach, or had been in that position with the Saints before. He was very good there. I think he's a great fit to get the best out of Trayvon Walker, to even help out Josh Allen more, to work with guys that they brought in, like Mason Smith. I think it's a phenomenal addition. It was the guy I would have went with. I was thrilled when they made the signing. And if there's someone you're going to trust on the defensive side of the ball to do his own thing, to not have to be coached up by Doug Pearson or, share power, like, it's Ryan Nielsen. Because at this point, like, if you're in that coaching staff above him, you're pretty dang happy, right? Because you just know you can trust him with the defense. He's proven himself, I think, throughout his time as a coordinator, as a positions coach. And to me, like, I think he's a future head coach candidate. He's a guy, like, even if things went wrong in Jacksonville, I'd still be wanting to keep him around. He's someone I want to keep around as long as you can on this team. And, technically we're saying this before we've ever seen him coach with the team, but he's proven it where he's been before. He's a very good guy to bring into this building. I think he brings in so many of the things you were frustrated by last year being missing from the team, specifically the accountability from the team and a little bit of that aggression you want to see as well. Tackling, all those things. So I love that move. I was super excited for it. And I think if you're talking about the most impactful moves this offseason, there's a very strong argument to say that hiring Ryan Nielsen could be the most impactful because he directly helps, I think, half the football team. I think he's going to be a good resource for all of them. And this guy's a teacher, something I didn't know. Like, he is going to improve these players' craft. He's going to demand excellence out of them. So I love it. I was a huge fan, super excited, and it's a great way to close out the front office moves here. Now, moving forward, we're going to talk about releases. We're going to talk about players that walked as well. So getting into releases, we've got 4 players. I try to list these generally chronologically. Folorunso Fatukasi was the first guy, RIP, because he got released on his birthday. But I gave this an A. The reason why I gave it an A was because, he didn't live up to the contract. He had some flashes, right? But he was injured a lot, and you ultimately couldn't really tell he was on the field. Like, you just couldn't see the impact. He wasn't a recognizable player. That's a problem. When you're earning like 8 or 10 million as one of those numbers, it's a lot of money. You have to be recognizable. You have to make an impact. Now, why this gets maybe not an A+ from me is because I don't feel like Jacksonville did enough to improve the run defense on this team. especially on the interior. And so I still have to give it a high grade because I wouldn't have kept him, even if I knew that maybe they weren't going to get a really good run defender, which I'm sorry, I'm not counting Jordan Jefferson there. But Fadakasi, it just never was going to make sense to keep him. And I'm glad Jacksonville made some hard decisions here. Now, Darius Williams, kind of a weird one to grade here. I gave it a D plus. The reason why I gave it a D plus is, while I understand that, yeah, if you keep Darius Williams this year, he's not going to play as well, right? He's a zone corner in a man coverage scheme. I really felt like there was an opportunity out there to maybe trade him. Perhaps they looked and didn't get any offers, but it was kind of shocking to me because he was one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL last year. Instead, he was just outright released, and it was kind of unfortunate it played out like that. So, if it's a case of they could not trade him, there's nothing they could do, then yeah, I get the move. It makes sense, but you're still also losing what was really your best cornerback last year. And, if Tyson Campbell's healthy, there's a debate there. But Williams had a phenomenal year. He finally had the turnover production. He was a lockdown corner on his side of the field, and it's a loss for this team. It's a hard player to replace, but you can understand the reasons why. Now, with strong safety Rayshon Jenkins, this gets an A+ for two reasons. One is that it was a lot of money. And two, it was a lot of money that you didn't have to spend because you had a young player in Antonio Johnson sitting right behind him, that this was an ideal place for him to play. He could play slot, he could play strong safety, either of those, but strong safety would be a really nice fit for him. And now you're able to put him back there at strong safety on a rookie contract, earning practically nothing for the next 3 years until he gets that second contract. It's a phenomenal situation. And when we're talking about how we want to build an NFL team, how we want to do this over time, this is a prime example of what you want to do. You want to get a steal late in the draft. You want to get a guy worth a lot at a pick he shouldn't be available at, that could start, like an Antonio Johnson. You get him on your team, you develop him for a year, you got your veteran there that maybe costs a little bit more. You save your money, you move on, and you got your replacement already on the roster, acclimated to the team, ready to go. I want to see more of that from Jacksonville, but I'm going to commend them for the one time that they have done that. And not that it's the only time ever, but the one very noticeable time we've seen this. Now, I talked obviously about, like, I think they didn't really value Antonio Johnson a lot, right? That was kind of a problem for me. They skipped him, I think, probably 5 times where he should have gone in the draft, but things still worked out, right? And they spent less on him. It cost them less, and technically it's the best case scenario. And so this is still going to get an A+, even considering that. It's a really good situation, and I'm glad the Jaguars could look past the draft pick they gave up for him and to be able to say, this guy is a starter, this guy is a good football player, and to give him a chance this year. I think it's a phenomenal decision and one of the best moves they made of the offseason. Now, the final one here, this isn't fully chronologically on this list, it is, but obviously this happened very recently. Zay Jones was also released by the team after the draft. I gave it an A because reason why, he wasn't going to be worth $8 million as a backup. You basically needed someone to get injured, then you needed him to play healthy, and you needed him to be as good as he's ever been to be worth that. So it just didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me to keep him. Now it also gets an A though, because you look at what Arizona paid him. And Arizona paid him like, I think, $4.25 million, something around there. So it's like, okay, maybe if I think about this, he would have been a nice player to have, because that's pretty cheap. Like, and that's what I wanted to see with some of these guys, where if you're going to keep them, at least make sure that you're not paying them the premium that's not necessary. Like, Zay Jones, in no world was going to earn $8 million this year after the season he came off of, with no guarantees on his contract. It just wasn't going to happen, right? And there's some other players we'll talk about that with, but I think they made the right decision. I think keeping him through the draft was smart. Make sure you have a backup plan, and perhaps, say they didn't get Brian Thomas Jr. and they pick someone else. and didn't get the wide receiver they felt comfortable with, maybe they were just waiting to renegotiate that contract. So I completely understand it. I think it's a good move, and they dealt with it really well. It's just, I think there's a little bit of an argument for the price he was worth. With Arizona, maybe you could have brought him back. But ultimately, I like the move a lot. And I gave this a B plus for the Jaguars in total. Not a super impactful grade, but I think they made a lot of the right decisions that they had to. And so I'd commend them for it. Now, talking about guys who just walked from the team. The first one's the worst grade of the offseason for sure. And I'll have to decide whether I want to go into details on that now or later. I think we'll wait though. But Calvin Ridley, it's the way you lost him. It's the process. It's the team you lost him to. It's every part of it. And like, I understand people are going to immediately say, well, would you have paid him $23 million? No, I would not have. You didn't have to though. There were other options on the table. And that's what's frustrating about it, because you wish that the tag was available. You wish that they didn't have the conditions if they really wanted to extend him, so they could have got it done when he wasn't on the market. It's the fact that everything was publicly announced to the rest of the teams in the league, and Tennessee played the game perfectly and completely outplayed Jacksonville. That's the frustration of it, and why it gets an F, because it is definitely one of the worst handled situations that I've ever seen in my time as a fan. And, you know, that goes to Josh Allen a bit too, and how they dealt with him, which we'll talk about later. But that's why that gets an F. It is very, very poor leadership in terms of how they dealt with that. Now, kicker Brandon McManus, kind of a weird one to give best move. My thinking behind this, even though it basically had no impact, was that, you know, for one, I wanted to get a young kicker. And to get one would be really nice. I think you had some good options in this class. You had a pick that lined up pretty well with where they were going to go. And McManus just wasn't good enough last year. I wanted to get a young guy in who maybe can be successful here. You keep around for a long time. You don't have the problems with kicker anymore. That was ideal, because they have not drafted one for quite a long time now. I don't think they've actually drafted one in all the time I've been a fan. So letting McManus go was the right decision. They also got kind of lucky with I can't remember the guy's name, Will Lutz, I think it was, from Denver. That contract getting rejected after he signed it. Kind of grateful for that. And then Joey Sly, you know, not having a whole lot of guarantees there, because I wanted them to get young at the position. I wanted them to draft the guy, and I think it worked out well. But the other side of this too, that didn't end up mattering, but I still gave it an A+ for it, was this was kind of a saving grace for the Jaguars as far as the compensatory formula, because he was not expected to count. He ended up counting towards it, so that helped them out if they were to get a pick back for Calvin Ridley. Now, unfortunately, the Jaguars didn't give a crap, and they spent a ton of money on a ton of different players, and they didn't get enough people who didn't count towards the formula. And, you know, part of the reason why the loss of Calvin Ridley as an F, you didn't even get a third-round comp pick out of it after he got paid $23 million. It was incredibly poor handling, but they got kind of lucky with the way Brandon McManus left, and the contract he got was shocking, but they made the right decision. I gave him an A+ for that, but not something that ended up being impactful at the end of the day. Now, K'Lavon Chaisson, I gave it an A, kind of the same reasoning as Zay Jones here, where, yeah, not really a reason to keep him. And also, it's not an A+ because you look at the contract he got, and it's barely anything. It's actually, in fact, like the exact same as what he had last year. So if they really believed what they said about him being great on special teams, it's a pretty good deal, actually, to get him for another year, $2.5 million. I know everyone's like, you're defending keeping K'Lavon Chaisson. I'm not necessarily trying to do that, but I'm just saying, like, based off the things they said, a $2.5 million, that would not have been that bad. But at the same time, I don't think he was going to get much better, and it's only natural that he goes to the Carolina Panthers. So it gets an A from me. Not really a player I was looking to keep, and it also was a good decision because that could have factored into the compensatory pick formula. He was a player you wanted to let go for that reason. Ultimately, of course, didn't end up mattering. Now, talking about Dewan Smoot, this is my other really bad grade here. To me, like, I can't remember. I'm gonna actually look it up here on the spot what his contract was with the Bills, but I know it was not expensive. Looking up these numbers right now. I should have had this ready before, but I actually hadn't seen it yet. So he is earning this year with the Bills supposed to be a cap hit of 1.5 million, just under that actually. So here's why this gets a bad grade. Okay, because for one, I understand that Dewan Smoot didn't have a good year. He didn't return like you wanted him to. There is still an excuse for that. And there is still very good film from just a year ago from before he tore his Achilles. I understand that he might not return to the player he was, but with having essentially no legit edge depth, and you still don't right now, how do you not return a guy who's been here forever, especially after this didn't matter for the formula at all? Why did you not return him for $1.5 million? Like that, I don't get that. I think that's just a blunder. It's not a huge blunder, right? It's not the end of the world, but it's just something where I'm like, why did we not just bring him back? Like that was an easy decision to me. And so I'm very confused by why they just let him go to Buffalo, because if he gets back to form, if he is able to fully recover from this injury now, which keep in mind he was brought back this last season immediately once he was recovered, and they don't play 100% after that. If he plays better with Buffalo, I mean, that's value you just threw in the trash. That's what's frustrating me about that move. And so I kind of understand it, but he's just a player I would have probably brought back this year. And I also apologize for misspelling his name there. There was a lot of typing on these graphics. Now, talking about Trey Herndon, our first of the last three guys. Trey Herndon, kudos to him, man. He had a great career in Jacksonville, and he's probably going to go somewhere else at some point if he hasn't already. He's turned into an actual like solid starter and nickel, and you love to see that, especially for the crap he got early in his career when he really didn't deserve it, just simply because he was the guy that had to start after Jalen Ramsey was traded. And so, I commend him for all that, but I do like that Jacksonville finally made the upgrade there. We'll talk, of course, about who the upgrade was later, but Trey Herndon was really figuring things out in coverage and actually was grading out positively according to PFF and playing better. Herndon at the same time was never really a good run defender. He was not a complete player. And so I think it was just a point for the team where you needed to make an upgrade. You kind of played your cards already with that. You know what Trey Herndon's going to be, and you need to do better. You need to be willing to upgrade this team. You need to not just keep the status quo. And he was a player that made sense, not being disrespectful at all, but just someone that I felt like would probably get a better shot on another team. And he should really, I think he could start for another football team. But we'll see what happens there. Maybe he's been signed, and I just haven't noticed. But this move made a lot of sense for Jacksonville to make an upgrade, but I do want to give him his flowers. He had a very good career in Jacksonville for what the expectations were. Just completely blew it out of the water. Now, talking about Shaq Quarterman, another player that he could end up coming back, I think, at this point. I don't think he's signed with anyone. Once again, I might be wrong on that. And maybe he did re-sign with Jacksonville. Hopefully he did. But it's sort of something where I just gave it a C because he's really buried in the linebacker room, but he's also a player that I'm cool with being on the roster because I think he's been fine on special teams. I think he's had his place, when he's come in as a backup. Obviously, the big one against Derrick Henry is a bit nostalgic from 2022, but he's a player I think should have made the roster, and, it's not the end of the world, but kind of a fun story too, to have the Jacksonville guy playing in Jacksonville. And if he's still out there, I hope they get something done to bring him back to this linebacker room, especially when, you got for example, like Chad Muma, who is barely going to be able to start. You just drafted Ventrell Miller. It would make more sense to maybe trade Muma to a team that would give him a chance to start and actually allow him to have a career, and then keep a guy who you know is a backup. It's not going to cost you anything. Actually, probably be cheaper than Muma in Shaq Quarterman. Like that's one way I would look at it, but not really a huge needle mover there. And then Jamal Agnew, hard one to give a grade to. I gave it a B plus because I think the replacement they got was better in Devin Duvernay. It just based off the fact that like Jamal Agnew, well, he had that incredible like string of returns in the postseason, and he had the great first year here. He hasn't really done anything crazy in the kick return game for a while, and that's just probably luck at the end of the day. But they're kind of at a point where he just wasn't justifying the numbers he was earning, and I think it just kind of made sense, and Jacksonville was able to, I think, get a little more value out of it with about the same amount of money in paying Devin Duvernay. So that's why I gave it a B plus there. But yeah, definitely, I mean, he's a player they're going to have to, they had to replace, right, when they didn't keep him, but I think they've done a decent job of that. Now, moving on to the next part here, we're going to start talking about players that were extended, players that were restructured, and then we're going to get into those free agency acquisitions that we've alluded to throughout this. So, with extensions and restructures, I've got 6 players here. Once again, going in chronological order. Ezra Cleveland is the first one. Someone that I was a massive fan of coming to Jacksonville when he did. Really excited about it because it was one of those moves that I actually, I didn't predict it, but I threw it out as an idea very heavily before it actually happened. I mentioned some of the same reasons why it ended up happening, because they had got Dalton Risner. Risner was starting. Ezra Cleveland was on his final year. Vikings didn't seem to want to keep him, and Cleveland was becoming a better pass protector in his final year. He was improving there. And to me, like, to get him then for a 6th round pick and not have to give up the comp pick you would have had to, or spend what would have factored in the formula, that was better, and you keep him off the market as well. So that was a good thing for Jacksonville to pull off that move. Now, of course, when they brought him in, he just didn't play the same. Didn't have a good year. And it's kind of a weird situation because I went from being this massive fan to kind of like, I don't know fully if I'd keep him, because it's kind of hard to make that big bet because, look, he's going to want 3 years, right? He's had 3.5 good years of play and half a year of bad play with an excuse. If you're the team that had him for the bad play, you're kind of inclined to not extend him compared to maybe another team on the market that's just looking at him like, well, we know he was great from all the airtime, we're going to keep him. So I think Jacksonville still made the right move and understanding there are reasons why Cleveland didn't play as well. I think one of the biggest ones was the people around him, right? Revolving door at left tackle, Luke Fortner at center. Not good for Ezra Cleveland, especially when, like, this guy's a good run blocker and he's got no one around him who can block for the run game. It's a problem. And so I like that they kept him. I like that the deal was not that expensive. I think it came out to like $8 million a year, maybe $9 million. So good stuff there on keeping Ezra Cleveland. I gave it a B plus, but I couldn't really give it an A just because, yeah, you technically saw last year he didn't play well in the system, but I think there's reasons for that. So kind of hard to give it a perfect grade on that. Now, Brandon Scherf, I gave a B plus as well. And the reason why I gave him a B plus was because I was very happy, first of all, that they at least restructured him. And not just restructured, but made him take a pay cut. And that was something that I thought they should have done for another player too, who we'll talk about at the very end of this video. But it was the right thing to do. To try to keep someone who's been here, who's been a leader, and to pay them what they're worth instead of just what they were worth 2 years ago. Scherf has gotten older. I'm not going to say he sucks, because he doesn't, but as you get older, you just don't play as well. And so it was hard for them to justify this contract all the way through, And this also works out really well because, well, for one, you're saving the money, right? But second, you don't have to release him next year. He will just straight up be a free agent, and that can help you out with trying to get comp picks in the future. And so that is something I factor in. I know I talk about it a ton when we're discussing free agency and all that. I try to look at all these little things, right? But at the end of the day, why it didn't get an A from me is that I still feel like 10 million is a little too much. I doubt anyone really agrees with me on that, and that's okay. That's just how I look at him. I would have preferred Jacksonville got younger and tried to acquire someone like that, or invested through the draft. I really wanted to see this team for the last 2 years, and it's funny. It was one of my first videos I ever put up on the channel. I wanted to see them improve the run blocking. It has been a thing of weakness for this team for a long time. And Ezra Cleveland was really nice for that. With Brandon Scherf, I don't think he's been that great in run blocking. And I wanted to see Jacksonville get younger, make a move there, and they ended up kind of just doing the same thing on the offensive line with one actual move that we'll talk about in the free agency acquisitions. So it's sort of middle of the road between average and, best it can be. So I gave it a B+ for that reason. Now, Dearness Johnson, I was really excited about the signing last year, given the value of the signing. I understand he's not a starter for the team, but I think he's a really nice backup, specifically because this was a guy when he was in Cleveland would come in when he had to and have monster games. And we haven't seen that, thankfully, because, well, ETN hasn't been hurt this last year. But I think Johnson can still do that. He's a little separated from it now, of course, which is why it's not an A+, but still, really good backup running back, and I think a great option to start if something's going wrong to ETN, and you don't have to really rush him back into the action immediately. And then Foye Oluokun, best move here for all your extensions and restructures. I think this was phenomenal for Jacksonville. They got back a player that was very good for them this last year, really on his way to being one of the very best linebackers in the NFL, and he already is, but just being publicly recognized for that and around the league. He is very much at that point, and the Jaguars were able to not only extend him, but they were able to knock down the price of this drastically. I think when we did the math, it was a flat-out 25% decrease in price. So you are paying one of the best linebackers in the NFL, which they can play for quite a while, and he will probably play fine for a lot of this contract, if not all of it, because it's 4 years. I think he can make it pretty far into that. You're going to have one of the best linebackers for like $11 million a year. Great deal for Jacksonville. Absolutely love it. Good job by them, and very thankful to Foye as well, because he knows he could have earned more, and he said that. But he wanted to be here. He wanted to have his future secured. And he made this decision, and it's great for the team, and I think really locks him down as a long-term piece and a core piece of this team for the years to come. And then you got Josh Allen, and if this was just the contract and the worth of the player, it'd be an A+, right? It gets a B because of how poorly this was handled, and I will talk about the details of that again at the very end, but They didn't try to talk to him early. They waited. They just did not handle this well. And he was wondering why they weren't talking to him. Like, just very embarrassing stuff to see publicly about your team and the way they handled it. But they also don't get killed on the grade because they actually got a pretty good deal on Josh Allen. They are not paying him $30 million a year against the cap. Like, if he plays perfect and nails every single condition, he gets close to $30 million. But it's more like 25 to 26. So maybe it worked out to where the longer they waited, it helped them more. Maybe not, but they got a much better deal than I was expecting for them to get out of Josh Allen. Now, final one here, a smaller one, Tyler Shatley. I count him as an inside offensive lineman or interior offensive lineman. He plays all over, so didn't really assign a specific position. But I think he's a good backup. I think he's a good alternative. He's done fine when he's had to start. Not great, right? But fine. he's a backup, and getting depth on this offensive line is important. I'm glad they did, especially for the reason that I don't really want to see Luke Fortner starting again on this team, and maybe Shatley can push him for that center spot after Mitch Morse. I don't know if that'll be the case, but it's just a move that makes sense. Didn't cost them much at all. So I'm definitely happy with that from Jacksonville. Now, we'll move on to free agency before we get into the draft here. The actual acquisitions for the Jaguars, we've got 8 players on here. And this also includes, of course, a trade that took place right before free agency. Acquiring Mac Jones from the Patriots, I think I originally gave this an A+ when I graded it. I went down to an A- just because this might end up being a move that really doesn't have an impact. But I think, simply put, like, he should be an upgrade as a backup. Like, theoretically. Might not be, but theoretically he would. And if he, hits free agency and you can't keep him as a backup, which is probably going to be the case, right? He doesn't plan to stick around Jacksonville forever. He wants to start in the NFL again, which that's fine. He should want that. This next offseason, when he hits free agency, if we don't extend him, he will probably end up getting back a comp pick if Jacksonville doesn't spend a ton that is worth what you trade for him. Because I think he could get a 5th. Like, it's a quarterback, and we've seen quarterbacks who shouldn't be that good actually get decent contracts. For example, Sam Darnold getting $10 million. Mac Jones could probably get something that would at least give you a comp pick back. And so this was a move where I thought, if they can kind of fix his image a bit, they're getting more out of it when he leaves, and they get a solid backup for a year. So the logic behind it's really good, and that's why I gave it a good grade. But there's also the world where it just really doesn't matter a whole lot, which is why it's not an A+. Now, Mitch Morse, one that I probably seem kind of low on here as far as a grade. I gave it a B. The reason why is because, while I think he is an eternity, just infinitely better than what Luke Fortner is right now, I think with Mitch Morse, you're still getting a player who's older, who's had some concussion issues, and the frustrating side of this for me, a player who's not a good run blocker. He has not been a great run blocker throughout his career, and he's getting older. It's not super likely that he plays to the exact same level that he was before. I still think he'll be fine. I think he'll be an average to maybe above average center for the team, but it was also kind of a 2-year investment, or it becomes a very expensive 1-year investment. Because if you do release him after this year, it was a 1-year, $7 million contract, because you have to pay out some guarantees. So that part of it's kind of frustrating, that you're kind of locked in to an older player, and I really wanted to see Jacksonville consider exploring maybe centers in the draft, just trying to reset there, trying to get younger on the offensive line. They didn't really do that. And so Mitch Morse, I think, is definitely an upgrade. I think it definitely helps, but it feels like another one of these things that what they did on the offensive line may look good enough, but it's kind of half measures. Like, yeah, they're going to be much better in pass protection, but still got the same problems in the run game. You still can't run it up the middle that well. It's kind of frustrating to be stuck there, especially with how much I really wanted them to do something there with having the running backs that they do on this team, specifically the one that wears number 1. Now, wide receiver Gabe Davis, I gave it a B+ after this whole offseason's passed. It's a move where I think the fit makes a ton of sense. I think what he brings is very valuable, and I trust Jacksonville at this point with bringing in some of these younger receivers who are overlooked or looked at as maybe just not that great. Christian Kirk was an example of that. I am not going to say Gabe Davis is Christian Kirk, but I do think he can be a more consistent producer for the Jaguars and be worth his contract. The only part of this that's kind of frustrating is that, well, if the wide receiver core does not work out this year, say it's not that productive, you cannot pivot for 2 years after this move, because you drafted Brian Thomas Jr. as well. you're not going to release Christian Kirk. There's no world where you do that unless he just is the worst player on the planet Earth this next year. And Gabe Davis is guaranteed 2 years of his contract. So that's a big issue with that deal, is that you really locked down your starters for a while and you overhauled the wide receiver core quite a bit. So it needs to work. And he is a risky player still. That is very much still true at this point. And if it does not work out that first year, you do not have an option going into the second year. You have to start him or you have to bench him at $13 million a year. I don't think that will be the case, but there is that side to this as well that is possible. So still a good grade, but it does end up being a B+. Now, Darnell Savage, he was my best move for the Jaguars in free agency. It's the allure of having him play in the nickel. With his skill set, with how good he is, with what you would require from a slot cornerback, he makes a ton of sense for Jacksonville, and I think he's going to be a really nice addition into that room and the mentality that he's going to bring to the defense. The main issue is, of course, tackling. That's what has been thrown out with him, but I think this is a much better situation for him. I think he's going to be a better player here. He was very good with Green Bay when he was in the nickel. So I'm really excited to see him play there. And I think it's going to be a very good year for him. I think he's a player who sticks around for a while. And that's what really justifies that decision with Trey Herndon to let him walk. This is what you need to do, is to go get a better player. And they did that with getting Darnell Savage on the Jaguars and for an affordable contract as well. If he's a good nickel, you got him locked down for 3 years at $7 million a year. It's pretty dang good. Now, Devin Duvernay wasn't a massive fan of this. I gave it a B-. The only reason why is because just my own philosophy. I probably wouldn't invest money into kick returners, but it's fine. He's literally arguably the best in the league. He's at least one of the best. And you didn't really spend a whole lot different from what you did on Jamal Agnew, who last offseason I would have kept. So it makes sense. I think it's a good move. And maybe he'll be able to play a little bit on offense for the team as well. I think he could definitely be a good backup there. And then Ronald Darby, I gave it an A. I think if he's on the field and he stays healthy, which that's the big if, and what probably will not happen if we're going off his history, he's a good player. And he's a really good fit for this team. And I think it was a phenomenal signing, especially if you wanted to develop a cornerback behind him. Now, I don't know if Jacksonville really has that heir apparent right now. I know a lot of people want to put Jerrion Jones out there. The thing with Jones is, quite frankly, I think he's a slot. I think that's where he's been best. That's where he's clearly played best. And then you talk about DeAndre Prince. I think he's a backup. And I think he can be a good backup, but I just don't see a world where DeAndre Prince is my heir apparent, and then he starts, and then I'm going to just think, oh, well, I don't got to worry about that position. I'm never going to think about investing in that again. I still think they need their guy. And so it's a good thing that Darby's here for 2 years for that reason. But I also, kind of wish this was a 1-year deal at the same time in the case that they had got someone. They didn't, so maybe you could give it an A+, but it gets a high grade from me. And then Eric Armstead, this was a fantastic pivot by the Jaguars. This came right after the Calvin Ridley deal was not approved, and he moved on to Tennessee, and Jacksonville pivoted really well. Actually, I think there's some debate if they even pivoted, because there was some talk they would have signed Armstead and Ridley if they had the opportunity. But this was a really good signing by the team, a very good contract for him as well, only at $14 million a year. If Armstead is healthy, it's one of the best defensive tackles in the league, and he's someone coming from a Super Bowl team, a team that's been very competitive. And I think he's going to really complete the starting groups on that defensive line. So I love it. Only reason why it doesn't get an A+ is because injuries. That's been a little bit of an issue. It could be an issue here. We'll see. I think it's probably going to flare up at some point in those 3 years that he's signed. But, good signing for the team. And then Travis Gibson, for me, I did just give it an A plus because there's the potential he's actually a productive backup pass rusher, rotational pass rusher, and you basically paid him veteran minimum. I mean, at worst, he's making the roster. That's the way I look at it. So, what can I really trash here? I just don't. I don't have anything I can go after. So, I like that move. But I didn't have it as the best move because to me, like, same grade as Darnell Savage, and Savage is a lot more impactful of a signing in my eyes. Now, moving to kind of the final part of the grading in this before we kind of wrap up and then get into the total grade for everything. We're just going to go through the draft really quick. Obviously, I recently recorded my thoughts on all the draft picks. I gave my grades on them, so we're using the same grades. I'm just going to run back through it really quick, though. So, draft gets a C plus for me. I had the best move as drafting Cam Little. Now, to explain that, I'm not saying it's the most impactful. I'm just saying with the value of the pick they had and who they got, I could argue is the best one. Because I think Cam Little is going to be really good. Now, could also just suck with the way kickers go. But I'm pretty confident in Cam Little, and it was a great pick for Jacksonville. And they had that selection at a really good time in the draft because the kicker run had just started then. And to me, Little was probably the second best kicker in this class behind maybe Joshua Carty, who I think was the first one to go. But overall, like, talking about the draft and why I gave it a C+, it was a great first pick, right? With Brian Thomas Jr. Phenomenal to trade back, get all the value they did, still get their guy. And Brian Thomas Jr. could be a top 10 prospect from this class years down the road. He has that potential, and some might even say top 5. I will probably stick a top 10, but he could be an incredible pick for 23 in the draft. So I love that. After that, you know, I think there's some solid picks here, like Jerrion Jones I've kind of grown on. I think that could be a really good nickel option down the road. I think I want to look at him that way instead of trying to force him to play outside because this is where I think Jones will be the best. I think the Javon Foster pick was also very good. But then you got the picks that it just feels like the ceiling for these selections is, it's not as bad as it was in 2023, where, like, you know, Brenton Strange, for example, the best case scenario is probably that he's worth the pick. That is the absolute best that you could get out of him. This year, it's a little bit better because, like, with Mason Smith, I think he could be worth the late first when you look back on this if he's able to develop into what I think he can be. Which what I think he can be is a good pass rusher on the interior, someone who could earn a big second contract, but probably isn't that great against the run. Maybe he can get up to average, good enough, and then those are the snaps where maybe he's resting on the sideline and getting ready to go back out and passing downs. If he can do that, that's a very good role for him. That's a very good outcome that is worth the pick and worth more than that. But then you get like Jordan Jefferson, where I think at best maybe he's a solid run stuffer, and you can get a little value out of that. There just wasn't a ton of incredible picks to me, other than like the Brian Thomas Jr. selection and then some of the later ones. So I couldn't give it a huge grade, especially with how loaded this draft class was, how many players were available at these selections, the opportunities to trade up. It just was not really, I think, their best outcome, and it was a little too far from that. Now, I also threw on Joshua Cephas on this graphic. I talked about him on Twitter, but he was a UDFA signing, and he was a 4th round guy for me when I did my grading. He got on there, and first thing I thought was, like, why the heck is no one talking about this guy? Like, he legit looks like he could start in the NFL when you watch his film. Now, I don't know if that's going to be the case. I don't think he's going to start for the Jaguars, but I do think he could be a really good backup and someone who could get on the field a little bit. I think I like Tim Jones, but I would probably rather have Cephas. I think Cephas is a legit rosterable player and will probably make the 53-man. So I threw him on here, and then, you know, quite frankly, I kind of ran out of room to rate Josh Proctor, but I know that was a player who was also supposed to get drafted that the Jaguars signed. He's an older guy. but still, like, seems like he graded out well. Maybe he can be a solid backup in the safety room. So that's great. I mean, if you're getting UDFAs like that for 3 years, bare minimum contract, and they can be a good backup or a solid backup, that's a good deal. So for me, C plus for the draft. Now, to kind of wrap this up, we're going to talk about best moves of the offseason. We're going to talk about worst moves of the offseason, and then what positions improved, what positions regressed, and then give my final grade for the entire offseason. So talking about the best moves. I got 7 things listed here. First one, and this is all kind of going chronologically, hiring DC Ryan Nielsen, one of the best moves this team made. Like I said, I think this could be the most impactful move of the offseason, the most impactful person on the team. I think he's going to elevate this defense immensely, and just comparing what he should be to, the shenanigans he had last year with people just leaving early every day, massive upgrade for the Jaguars. And I'm really excited for Ryan Nielsen. I hope he sticks around here as long as possible. But if he's a guy who ends up being great and gets a head coaching job, awesome. And I'm only saying that now because there's been talk about it already before he was in Jacksonville. So I think it's fair to mention that. The second thing for me was making Antonio Johnson a starter. This was something I was a little concerned might not happen. It ultimately did end up taking place. I think Johnson is going to have the potential to be an impact starter, and I think he will be. He was a second-round guy for me that year, and someone I actually liked a lot early in the process. And if you remember anything about draft articles from that time, there were some people in Jacksonville's media saying he might be an option at 24. He's a good player, and he played great, had a good year. In his limited time, he was grading out well in damn near everything and was not bad on the field. So passing the eye test and passing stats, great stuff from him. And I think he even had 2 picks with 100 to 200 snaps. So just phenomenal what you saw from him. And he earned a starting job, and I think this is a very clear example, like I said, of what I want to see this team do with its building, trying to bring in guys who can start in the future and being able to move on from expensive contracts. So love that from Jacksonville. Extending Foye Oluokun at a discount was an incredible move too. You lock down a great player, and you don't got to worry about it for a long time. You don't got to worry about the cap hits either. It's going to be cheap. It's going to be affordable. It's going to be good for Jacksonville. And I think by the time guarantees run out, he's still going to be a good player, or that's, maybe the point where he falls off. But I think the time that you have to have him here, it's going to be worth it. It's going to be very good value for the team. And then pivoting to Eric Armstead after losing Ridley was another great move. I think it really kind of turned around the offseason from being just really a shit show at the end of the day, because it was really bad after Ridley walked. Just the way that was handled was atrocious. But getting Eric Armstead was a great pivot and a great use of their money. And if Armstead's as good as he's been in San Francisco when he's healthy, he could be worth what Ridley is. So very good pivot by Jacksonville to use the money there, and to not have spent a ton as well in total, just with not having signed Ridley. And then getting Darnell Savage to play in the slot was another very good move. I know Green Bay fans and people, even like that franchise guy that followed the team very closely, are very excited about him playing in the slot. A lot of them understand that's where he was going to be best. Jacksonville's going to give him a shot there. He should theoretically be very good this year. And if he's very good, that's a hell of a contract to have him on. And then getting into draft stuff to wrap this up, trading back with Minnesota, getting your guy, ridiculous value. Now, they got to use those picks well. But at the end of the day, this is still house money. Not that they should treat it like that. But it's a great move. Great value. One of the best trades I think we've seen from Trent Baalke in his time here. And yeah, just very, very impressed that they were able to pull that off. Kind of crazy to think, too, that he wanted more out of them. If you went and watched the hunt, he was literally demanding, I think, like a 4th rounder instead of 167 they were trying for. So He's pretty ferocious with the trades, but when he pulls them off, they do work out pretty well. And then the final one here, signing UDFA wide receiver Joshua Cephas. Like I said, he's a 4th-round guy for me. He was a good player. He is someone who I think has the upside to start in the NFL. He's a big build as well. It's a big receiver. You're not going to worry about size issues. Like, it's a lot to work there with him, and I really think you're going to see him make the roster and get some snaps this year with the wide receiver course. So, all things I loved, and really, I mean, these are great moves for Jacksonville. Now, unfortunately, that's not the whole story of the offseason. There's also some pretty bad things that happen, so we'll talk about that quick. The first one I mentioned at the start was retaining Trent Baalke. I understand that there's been good things that have come out of having Trent Baalke here, that if you didn't have him, you wouldn't have had the players, right? Christian Kirk wouldn't be here. Evan Ingram wouldn't be here. Foye Oluokun wouldn't be here. These first-round picks wouldn't. Like, at the same time, just being good at certain things and really bad at others doesn't justify having a lockdown job. I think to win a Super Bowl, the expectations have to be higher, and I don't think he's going to meet those expectations. I think there will be times where it may look really good, but at the end of the day, I don't think the Jaguars will win a Super Bowl with him here. And unfortunately, this may end up being a big waste of time. That's the thing I fear the most. And I hope I'm wrong. Like, I don't want to hate Trent Baalke. I don't really hate him, but I just don't think as a GM that he's complete. I don't think he's willing to learn when he makes mistakes. I think he's afraid to admit that, and it's kind of unfortunate. I think as well, leaving Cam Robinson's contract as is was a big miss, and this could still change, to make that clear, and maybe you'll watch this after they change it. I hope they do. But paying him the amount they are after he's played 2 years, not the full seasons, being out for games, getting injured, I get he's been a very good pass blocker and a decent run blocker, but I just think, like, look, if he's healthy and he's playing how he plays, the contract is worth it. But he has not proven that for multiple seasons. So you don't pay the guy at his ceiling. So at the end of the day, like, if he plays well this year, you're getting bang for your buck, but you're not getting more. And with your funds, I think you want to focus on trying to get more value than you should. And so leaving it as it is, especially when you could just simply say, like, hey, we will give you incentives to get you back up to that number. Because if you give out incentives that he didn't reach last year, but he reaches them this year, you can still pay him 18, 17 million, but the cap hit's only maybe 10 million. That's what I don't understand here. There was money available for the Jaguars to save. They could have even kept him. I think even if they released him and let him see his market, I think he would have let them match an offer. Worst case scenario. And I don't think another team out there was going to pay Cam Robinson this amount. So I'm glad they restructured other deals. I'm glad they thought about that. But this was a missed opportunity. This was one of the biggest areas where they could have saved cap. I understand they have a ton right now, but he also, need another pass rusher, which we have on this list at the very end. And you could have used that money on a pass rusher. You wouldn't have had to give up a lot in draft capital, and you'd be in a better situation. So kind of a miss there for them. And then the lack of urgency to negotiate with Josh Allen was completely inexcusable. I really would love to hear a reason why that happened, because I can't think of a reason in my mind to justify it. They basically it's like they went to Cancun for a month, forgot about their jobs, and then came back and like, oh shit, franchise deadline or franchise tag deadline is like 2 weeks away. We haven't even talked to this guy. Why do I have 10 voicemails on my phone from the last day? Like, it makes no sense why they waited. You have a superstar pass rusher who was, second or third in sacks this last year. Incredible player, a player that you literally will not win without right now. Like, this defense will be a disaster if you don't have him. And they played games with it. And I don't get why. I don't think they got anything good out of doing that, really. I think this was something where Once you saw him start working out last year, sure, I understand if you don't want to do it in the season, but I think that was an option. And at worst, once you were eliminated, this was one of the biggest items on the menu for you to take care of. Because of the next thing on this list, losing wide receiver Calvin Ridley of the Titans. It wasn't as much a problem with the way they set up that trade, which people will probably disagree with immediately because they're like, well, that led to the whole thing. But if Jacksonville had the franchise tag, they would have avoided it. And I think that's what the plan was. And they'd never planned to use it on Josh Allen. And they got into a situation where they had to. And Josh Allen wasn't extended before. Why wasn't he extended? Because they didn't talk to him. So they essentially lost what was the biggest trade acquisition they've had in Calvin Ridley because they didn't feel like talking to Josh Allen until weeks before the franchise tag deadline. Stupid reasoning. Absolutely stupid reasoning. Now, I understand if people are like, oh, they never should have paid $23 million to Calvin Ridley. I understand that. But I also will sit on the fact that, or maybe it's not a fact, but what I really do believe and think there's an argument for, that you could have at least tagged and traded him. I understand you're probably not getting a first, a second, maybe even a third for him, but you could have got something. And you could have at least had the flexibility to not have to worry about the compensatory pick formula and free agency. You could have got something in return. For example, why would the New England Patriots have not traded 103 for Calvin Ridley? A fourth rounder with all this money in the world that you got sitting around to go get Calvin Ridley, you think they wouldn't do that? I think they absolutely would have. So you got teams I think would have considered it, and you could have got a deal done as one option. I think as well, like, if they just franchise tag him, you probably could have got him back on an amount that wasn't $23 million. That was not what they were expecting to sign him to when Calvin Ridley had pretty much agreed to a contract hours before the deadline where he could finally sign it. So there's just other options that they forced themselves out of. And it almost feels like if they didn't plan to use the franchise tag on Josh Allen, and they thought they could use it on Calvin Ridley a year ago, which is this is speculation, right? Did they think Josh Allen was just going to suck this year? And were they just not willing to accept he was good and they didn't talk to him and extend him and get this taken care of? Man, I really wonder. It's just, whether or not that's right, I'm not going to say it is. It's hard to justify the way this was dealt with. There's just no excuse. So there's my rant. You've heard it before if you followed me over the summer. But that is a massive failure of this offseason. Now, other things, being big spenders in free agency. Look, they weren't the biggest spenders, but they did pay for a lot of players, and that's how they fixed their issues. And I understand that free agency is to address needs, but I don't think you have to nail it as hard as Jacksonville did. I think you want to rely on the draft a little bit for those two, and it'll naturally take care of itself when you're taking best players available, because positions that are different will fall. You're not just going to pick one position and get screwed. And so they spent a lot of money again. They pushed a lot of money down the road, and that's kind of the frustrating thing here. We're not getting better with cap space. It looks good right now, but we'll talk about later this offseason when we analyze the health of the salary cap. There's a lot of dead money pushed to future years. Thankfully, the cap shoots up, but it is undeniable that the team will be at a disadvantage against others, against practically every other team in the league except maybe the Eagles, in just a couple years because of the decisions that are being made now with their spending. I would have preferred this offseason that the process wasn't to just fix everything for free agency, but to fix some problems through the draft, to start bringing in your talent through there and developing a good football team. And I just don't think they took advantage of that. That's the next thing. Reaching in a strong draft class. This was the first year I got to fully analyze a draft class. And, obviously there'd be a little bit of bias there, but this was universally seen as a very strong draft class. And I will say that at almost every pick the Jaguars had until maybe the 5th round, there were players on the board that were pretty much home run picks. Like, it would be almost impossible to not see them as a very good value there. And they just didn't get those players. They got a good first round player. Like, I will always give them credit for that. It's what they do every year. But second round, like, you got opportunities to move up. You can't trade up though, because your GM doesn't want to offer anything even competitive to move up. And so you get players like Johnny Newton, players like Jackson Powers Johnson, Kool-Aid McKinstry, who they could not get. They couldn't get a trade done. Instead, they're picking Mason Smith, who might end up being good, might end up being worth a little more in the pick, but that's the ceiling. He has to prove that. I hope he does, but it's just kind of unnecessary then too, because you also look at the defensive tackles available at 48. Chris Jenkins Jr. has the same upside as a pass rusher, but he's a great run defender already. He's immediately someone who could play on the field. And that's I think, to me, like, looking at how the defensive line looked after getting Eric Armstead, I could have argued run defense was more important. So it's just things like that where you're getting a player who's just objectively worse right now, doesn't have a higher ceiling, and then maybe isn't even as big of a need. So it's just reaching for unnecessary reasons on a lot of these picks. And we're always going to root for these guys. I'm not saying that I hate them. Like, it's not true. But it's frustrating when this happens over and over. And what you're going to see over time, if Trent Baalke stays here, is that this team will not be able to solve their problems with young players. They're going to consistently have to spend. More money is going to get pushed down the road, and you're not going to really have the results to even show for it. Now, the final thing here, and this could still be addressed, it's not over completely, but they have not added a quality edge rusher, and their room behind Josh Allen and Trayvon Walker is incredibly weak right now. I don't know what Yasir Abdullah is. He's definitely undersized. He has some potential, but we don't know anything about that. You got Travis Gibson, who, look, like, I get he's had incredible preseasons. I get he worked really well with one of the guys in the staff when he was, I think, with Chicago. He also hasn't played in the regular season, like, at all for a couple years. So you have to bet a lot on those guys being, like, solid rotational pass rushers. And if Trayvon Walker or Josh Allen go down, this defense is a shell of its former self. Just like that. There's no plan behind that. You also got a team struggles to trade for players unless it is, like, only them competing for it. The team wants to do a fire sale. That's really the only way it's going to happen. So that's kind of scary right now. That is a big problem that could take place this year. But you hope, obviously, they stay healthy and maybe this doesn't matter as much, but it's a little scary. Now, talking about positions that improve, positions that regress, we'll just move through this quick. I know them as notable and marginal. So notable would be like bigger improvements or bigger regressions, and then marginal would be ones that didn't really change a ton. Maybe it's like a backup. So notable ones, I felt like slot corner, massive upgrade going from Trey Herndon to Darnell Savage. Defensive tackle, going from Fadikasi to having Eric Armstead is a huge deal. Even brought in Mason Smith, who I think can be nice in the rotation right now. And maybe down the road ends up being a really good starter. That's definitely possible. The center position, well, I think Mitch Morse is kind of getting close to average now as a player, although he's still above average. Luke Fortner was just so far off from what you wanted that it's got to be a notable upgrade there. It's a big deal and something that was a very good move this offseason. The marginal ones, the ones that are debatable, I'll actually start with the last one there, quarterback. I only said this because Mac Jones was added. It's not going to be a regression. I mean, they add someone to the room, and he obviously, when he was confident, when he was playing his game, like, he could start. It's good enough to do that. We'll see if he gets back to that, though. And then wide receiver is actually pretty debatable. You could actually throw this in regressions if you want, because, well, I think long-term it is a much better situation than Zay Jones and Calvin Ridley. You know, just comparing players is Brian Thomas Jr.'s first year as a player who still needs to develop a little bit going to be better than Calvin Ridley? I think you could actually say right now Calvin Ridley would be better at this point. I don't think it'll stay that way, but at least year one for Brian Thomas Jr. versus Calvin Ridley in Tennessee's first year, I think Ridley could be more productive, but it's close. And then you're talking about like Gabe Davis versus Zay Jones. And I think Davis is better. So depending on how you look at it, you can kind of swing either way, but I will go with an upgrade because I do think that Davis is an upgrade over Jones, and I think that BTJ will come close to what Ridley's doing, and it'll be pretty negligible as far as the difference between them. Now, there are a couple regressions on the roster, not massive deals, but I wrote defensive ends. Dewan Smoot is pictured there, just kind of giving an example that they lost players this offseason. They never really went out and replaced them. So starters look great, right? Like, if you have your guys in that are in right now and they stay there and they're healthy, that's great, but you still need a rotation, and there's not much there. They need to do something at that position before the season if they want to be careful, they want to be safe, and they want to have a good pass rush rotation, which is necessary to succeed. And the marginal one was cornerback, because this is more so comparing how Darius Williams played in zone coverage versus maybe how Ronald Darby plays in man. So, yeah, I understand Darby is better than Williams is in man coverage, but just saying the cornerback performance from last year is probably better than what's going to be this year, realistically, when you're talking solely about the boundary corners, because, you know, like I said, nickelback is going to be better. So those did regress a little bit, not massive deals, but just things to note. So now to wrap this up, final grade for the offseason, I actually just gave it a C+. It was better than I expected. Not incredible, though. There were missed opportunities, but the team is better. I think it's hard to say that's not the case. And look, the record may not actually show that by the end of the year. That's possible. This team could actually even go like 8-9. Could also go 12-5. Like, there's a lot of different outcomes. It's kind of hard to predict it. Right now, I'd probably say 10-7 would be where I'd lie. And I don't even know if that makes the playoffs. But pros for how they dealt with this offseason, there were clear improvements with the team and staff. Talking about the team, you know, there's positions of improvement we just went over. There's more talent on this roster now. And so I like that. The staff, the only change is going from basically Mike Caldwell to Ryan Nielsen. And Nielsen's better. And I think his staff under him won't leave early. So that's a good thing. It's all improvement. And the Jaguars made some hard but correct moves. They did some of the right things that may not have been easy. Rayshawn Jenkins is an example of that, where, yeah, you could start him if you want to and pay him that. It's okay. I don't think it's a great use of your money, but like, it's hard to move on from him though, because he's a guy who had some huge plays for the team. He had those great moments in 2022 that fans loved, and it's hard to move on from that. But it's about, what can you do for me now? That's what matters at the end of the day. And so those hard decisions, I think Jacksonville made. Luke Fortner was another one where, you know, this is probably the first guy that Trent Baalke's drafted that he's had to bench on this team, like, permanently. So that's a hard decision for him, but he did make that decision. I give him credit for that. And the big questions, I feel like they were mostly answered. Not everything per se, which those will be kind of part of our cons, but they made some additions they had to. Like, wide receiver was a concern heading into the draft. They got a great player. They've answered what they're going to do with Calvin Ridley walking. They've answered what they're going to do with the bad defensive line on the interior. They brought in Eric Armstead. They answered what they were going to do with center. They got a new starter in Mitch Morse. Like, there's other things I can note too, but the concerns were addressed this offseason. It's just a question of how they addressed them. Was the best way to do it? Is this the best long-term thing? You know, these decisions mostly will probably work out for now, but, you know, here on this channel, we're very focused on the long term as well. It's not just about 2024, it's about every year beyond as well. And so those are some of my concerns. But getting into cons along the same note, problems were solved with money, and problems were pushed down the road. They used a lot of void years. They continued to backload contracts, and they didn't really fix problems through the draft other than really just the first pick they made, which is really the only starter they're going to get out of this class, other than, well, for now, other than the kicker in Cam Little. They fixed these problems with free agency. They fixed it with veterans. They did that once again. Sometimes you have to, but it's a problem when you're consistently doing that. So this is now 2 of the last 3 years where we've had to do this, given different amounts of money spent. Second thing, draft picks have ceiling to be marginally good value. What I mean by that is that the ceiling for these picks is for them to be worth slightly more than where the player was taken. That should not always be the case. There are going to be some picks that turn out like that, but you also need to get guys that just simply should not be available at selections. There were always guys who fell in the draft. I mean, I'll name some guys from this last class, and I'm not saying this as in they had to pick every single one of these guys. I understand they're not always going to. Sometimes they're going to be low on them. It's just hard for me to believe you're low on every single consensus player who's falling for the past 2 years. That's what I don't believe. And why I think sometimes these picks are predetermined. Especially when we hear Mason Smith's going to be the pick, at pick 33? And we already know who we're selecting at 48. Shouldn't be the case. But we already threw out guys in the second round. Third round, you still had players like TJ Tampa on the board. He even went into the fourth. He had wide receiver options in a room that I think still needed backups. Still could have taken players you could have developed to get cheaper there, because you're spending a lot of money still on Kirk and Gabe Davis, and you can have injuries. You saw it last year. Javon Baker was one of those players sitting there. That was a second round guy. You throw out someone like Devontae Walker as well. There were players sitting there that would have made a lot of sense that Jacksonville just kind of skipped over. Didn't really worry about. You could even throw out Troy Franklin if you're into that kind of receiver, which I was a big fan of his, till I learned that he wasn't as big as I thought. But he was a player that should not have been available there. And I understand that these aren't always like positions of huge need or the most obvious, but you would have liked to see Jacksonville have some picks like that could have really been worth it. I think they're limiting with their resources how much they could have got out of them. That's what's frustrating with how they drafted this year, and even more frustrating with the year before, where the ceiling was really just the value of the pick itself, which isn't good enough. You don't spend just to earn your money back. You spend to get more back than what you spent. So that's an issue I have. Team building philosophy, I feel like it took minor steps, if any. And the minor step would probably just be the picks having slightly more value this year, being slightly more defensible. They were better, but it's just still not really how you want to see a team get built. It works right now. Might work while Trent Baalke's here, but I feel bad for the GM that would have to take over after, because they're going to come into a situation where they're going to have dead cap hits. They're crazy. They're going to have bad contracts. They're not going to have a ton of young talent that's getting developed. There's going to be problems when that happens eventually, whether next year or years down the line. It's just the way this team's being built, and it may look all right now. Like, it's fun when you're maxing out your credit card, right? I'll be honest, I've done that before. It's great when you can spend money, but you regret that pretty quickly, and eventually you got to go pay that off. And so, not a good way to build a team to me. And I'm not saying everything's bad about it. I think there's things they do that are just fine, but it's a problem. Like, I know Trent Baalke, he said before, like, he doesn't want to spend a ton of free agency, but when you can't draft well, you have to. So he kind of gets forced to go against his own philosophy, which seems to be better than the one he actually has to carry out. And then just the final thing here, because we didn't really mention it too awfully much, the run blocking on this team is still very weak. And I think it limits Travis Etienne, who is that young superstar. You have a very talented young player who I think could lead the league in rushing. I think he has that kind of potential. He's played incredible behind a very bad run blocking offensive line. To me, it would be a priority, even when if I'm Doug Pearson, I'm a head coach that wants to pass the ball. if I have Travis Etienne on my team, I don't give a crap that that's my priority. I'm still considering upgrades to my run blocking. I'm still factoring that in to the team because I can win that way too. If I want to get up and dominate a game, you can still run the ball when you're up 7. You're going to kill him if you have Travis Etienne behind a good offensive line. But they just haven't taken steps forward like you want. Like, I don't think Mitch Morse is going to be that good in run blocking. I think he'll be a little more aggressive. I think he'll have a little more fire. You saw that on film if you watch him at all. But not a great run blocker. Like, it's just frustrating to have a player like that on his rookie deal, and we can't get him an offensive line to run behind. To the point where he's just got to run outside the tackles every time. So I really wish that there was an emphasis there, but there has not been any at all. Ezra Cleveland is the closest we've ever come to that, and I think that had more to do with him being an athletic player who had been with the OL coach before. That guy was there in Minnesota when Cleveland was drafted, and it just made sense, especially given they needed a left guard. So those are problems I had with this offseason, but still, the team got better. It's hard for me to sit here and say, like, well, team got better, but I'm going to give them a terrible grade. I think a C+ is fair because you are spending some of your future resources. You are making things more difficult in the future, and you missed out on opportunities too. You could have done that much better this offseason, but they didn't. And we've still got some problems to address in the future that are just simply kind of being ignored right now. So that's kind of how I see this. It was a better than expected offseason, but still plenty of room to improve with how they dealt with things and some issues that could arise for the squad in 2024. So that kind of wraps up our off-season stuff. I think a lot of this stuff going forward is going to be more focused on the upcoming season. We'll talk about players, of course, still, but a lot of these roster moves are kind of coming to a close. We're going to look towards the future, continue summer scouting on this channel for those who want to watch. Understand if you don't, of course, but hey, it'll be there in 2025 when the season's over and we're looking at the draft again. That'll be a resource, so you'll have that too. But that's all I've got for today. I appreciate you guys watching. It's been great. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.